Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. You all had a great Thanksgiving holiday. I am very pleased to introduce to you my teacher, Dr. Eugene Rousseau, who is here with us today. And I think maybe it would be good if we very quickly went around and just introduced ourselves, and then maybe Dr. Rousseau could say a few words about himself, and we'll kind of kick this conversation off. So who would like to go first? Let's do this quickly, please.
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay, they can go first.
My name's Nick. I'm a junior music education major.
Okay.
I play the saxophone.
Well, I play saxophone also.
Yeah. Right now I'm working on the Creston Sonata. I'm working on Three Romances for soprano sax, and then also a piece called Storm, which is on tenor sax and also with electronics.
Well, you have enough to keep yourself busy.
For sure.
Okay, Nick, good to meet you.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Andrew Bender. I'm a senior majoring in music technology. I also play the saxophone. Right
Good.
now I'm working on a Paul Desmond transcription. And yeah.
Well, Paul Desmond, quite a saxophonist. I mean, he had quite an interesting style. Do you agree?
I would.
Yes. I remember being quite excited about hearing him play. Oh, good. And so you're a senior. Good. And will you go into a teaching position? Is that the objective?
I actually want to do sound design.
Oh, okay. Good. Good. Well, I wish you well in your endeavors.
Thank you.
I'll go next.
Oh, go ahead, Maggie.
I'm Maggie. I'm a sophomore, and I'm a music ed and saxophone performance major. And I'm working on Black and Blue by Barry Cockcroft right now.
Oh, that sounds good. I'm glad to meet you, and it sounds like the three pieces you have, or whatever, 3 or 4 pieces, is enough to keep you busy right now.
It's nice to meet you too.
Thank you.
My name is Spencer, and I am a senior in music technology, just like Andrew. But I see myself going to more of a studio recording setting.
Oh, good. Good. Well, this is a tremendous, vast profession. You know, there's so many aspects to it, and always something to learn, isn't there?
There sure is.
Well, I wish you well. Good to meet you.
I guess I can go next. Hello. My name is James Kim. I'm a first-year music education major. I play
Good.
sax, and I also play the violin. I'm a double major.
Oh, good.
And right now, I'm working on the Bozza aria.
Well, that's a marvelous piece. Do you know anything about the background of that piece, where it came from?
I know a lot of it is inspired by Bach, and no, being a violin major also, so I have my familiar. Yeah, I'm very familiar with Bach.
Yeah, there certainly is Bach is certainly in there. This was originally by Bach. This was an organ piece, and it's been, many people think it's originally for saxophone. The transcription is, I mean, originally the piece is for organ,
Yeah.
but Bozza used a good share of that and made it a saxophone solo. But since then, as you may know, you can buy this for flute, for oboe, for clarinet. It's quite a famous melody.
It is. It really is.
All right. Well, I guess I'll go next. Hi, I'm Philip. I'm a freshman music education major, and right now I'm working on Three Women and some Charlie Parker transcriptions out of the Omni book.
Nice. Those are terrific and quite challenging. I always have enjoyed working with those. Yes, you bet. And if you look at the dates on some of the pieces, it seems like it was decades ago. Well, it has been several decades, but I always find it refreshing to play these solos. Now's the time, right?
Yes, sir.
Does that ring a bell? If I say now's the time? Okay.
All right. My name's Daniel. I'm a freshman music education and saxophone performance major. And right now I'm working on the Boats aria as well.
Oh, good. Good. Now, as I understand it, at this time, given the COVID situation, you're not able to work with a pianist. Is that right? I think
Yeah, sadly, no.
it's unfortunate. But you're working on a piece, as I mentioned, it's a beautiful melodic line. I wish you.
Thank you.
I suppose I'll go next. I'm not actually a member of the studio, but I'm Kyle's colleague from down the road at Radford, where I also teach saxophone, and happy to join today.
Well, I'm glad to be with you. Yes. So when you say, did I understand you to say down the road, means it's nearby?
Yeah, about 15 minutes or so away.
But you're in contact.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Kyle and I have collaborated in the past, played at the Navy Band Symposium and done a few concerts and that kind of thing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Good to meet you.
Likewise.
And finally, we have David. I don't know if David, you want to say a word? Your microphone is muted. It's in the bottom left-hand corner where the microphone icon is. Do you see it, David? No. Well, this is my predecessor here at Virginia Tech, David Jacobson, who is the saxophone professor here before.
Good. Well, good to be with you.
And we're thankful to have you with us today. So maybe we could start, Dr. Rousseau, by talking a little bit about your experience with the saxophone. How did you start playing, and what was your education and upbringing like?
Well, I'll start by saying that many people I have met in recent years are astounded when they find out I do not have a degree in saxophone. When I started college in 1950, it wasn't possible. It was not possible to be a saxophone major. Now, I know some people are astounded to hear that that's the way it was. And to give you a little perspective on this, Marcel Mill began teaching at the Paris Conservatory in 1942. Now, if we think about this for a moment, which pieces for saxophone were available to him in 1942? Now, this is not a class in music history, but just think about it for a moment. Of all the pieces you might know and like, which were actually available at that time, you can count them on one hand. You had Bernard Haydn Sonata, Creston Sonata, Creston Concerto, which was 1941. And what else did we have? There was no Des Enclos. There was no, you can go on and on. So it's really something where we are today. I bring that up just as a reminder. Things have happened. Things have moved forward with our instrument. And Kyle, you and I look across the country or the world, the number of colleagues and friends we have who are professional saxophonists, have teaching careers. It's really quite amazing. It really is quite amazing. So we're dealing with a young instrument, and fortunately we have a tremendous repertory. We really do. Now, we don't have any original pieces by Brahms or Schumann, of course not. But the repertory we have is most interesting. And Kyle, I know that you're able to introduce your students to a lot of the contemporary techniques and some of the contemporary music we have today, which is highly interesting and challenging. But it's out there, and I think that's one of the great things today is that the saxophone is really much more accepted now as a classical instrument. I often would hear, as well, even not so many years ago, walk down the street with my gig bag, and people times would ask me, "Oh, what is that?" I said, "Saxophone." "Oh, do you play jazz?" That was the sort of the standard question. And I love jazz, and I know some of you love jazz too, and this is great. This is fine. It's just another example of the versatility of our instrument and the possibilities, enormous, the tone color, the technical possibilities. It's just tremendous. Okay, that was a little bit going maybe, but in answer to your question, when I was a boy, there was no music, there was no band program in my grade school, but the fourth grade teacher loved music, and so she met with a few of us, about 6 or 8 of us, 2 mornings a week before school, just to learn something about our instruments. That was my introduction. And I chose the saxophone because a neighbor boy played saxophone, and I thought this was well, I didn't use the expression at the time. If it were today, I would have said it was a cool sound. But that word wasn't in my vocabulary. But I did really enjoy that. And so that was why I chose. I was taking some lessons from a professional trombonist who was a wonderful musician, not a saxophonist. And he helped me a lot musically. And I was going to enter into the high school competition, solo competition. So this person, I remember, here's a trombonist, and he wrote out for me, made a note of this piece. I think you should get this piece for the competition. So I took this paper with up to Chicago, and I went down into the city the next day, and I bought some reeds. Now, in those days, we bought by the piece. I don't think any of you do, or any of us do that today. We buy a box of reeds, probably, but I bought 1 or 2 reeds, 3 reeds, maybe max. And this salesman who happened to play saxophone, "Oh, are you going into the competition this year?" And I said, "Yes." "What are you going to play?" I said, "Well, I just bought the music. My teacher gave me this title, and I just bought it." "Oh, what is it?" I said, "Well, I have the music here," and I pulled out the music. Jacques Ibert, Concertino de Camera. And this salesperson, his jaw dropped, and he said, "Have you heard Marcel Mule's recording of this?" And I said, "Who?" I had no idea who he was talking about. So I went out and I bought the recording the same day. It was a two disc set, 78 RPM. I think some of you might know what 78 was. And when I played that on my parents' Victrola, that time, that was a wind-up machine, and I put that on, I couldn't believe it was a saxophone. was mesmerizing. Anyhow, that's how I got started. The rest is history, more or less. But when I couldn't make saxophone, I majored in clarinet. I also studied oboe. I also studied bassoon, flute, all the woodwinds. And that was my emphasis for a number of years, woodwinds. Gives you a little idea, I think, of my background.
And how did you end up in Paris with Marcel Mule?
When I was at the University of Iowa, and I enrolled there in a PhD program, again, there was no Doctor of Musical Arts. And Jaime Waxman was my principal teacher at Iowa. And I applied for a Fulbright grant. Fortunately, I was a Fulbright grant, and that was for study in Paris with Marcel Mule. It was one of the great experiences of my life. A wonderful gentleman and somebody who really was a true pioneer in classical saxophone.
What were those lessons with him like?
Well, it was interesting because, as some of you probably know, that the Paris Conservatory at that time, and as far as I know, they still operate this way, there's a class of students. It may be 12, maybe around 12 students. And the class meets weekly, and one doesn't know when one will play. We all would practice, but at class, Professor Mule would call on someone to play. So you had to be prepared, and that was your lesson. You had your lesson in front of your colleagues. But as I was on a Fulbright grant, not only did I go to these classes, but I had private lessons with Mr. Mule, which was really a great honor. And I met with him every other week, every other Saturday for 3 hours. A 3-hour lesson twice a week. Quite an experience. And I remember on the first lesson, he said to me, "Would you like to speak French, or would you like me to speak English with you?" Well, I didn't speak French at the time, but I was trying to learn. And so I said, "I would like to study French, so please do that." So then he said, "Ah, très bien, comme vous," and then he said to me in French, as you are a beginner, I will speak very slowly." So we started out, and he wanted me to work on, I don't even remember what the piece was, but he said, "Now, when we meet the next time, I want you to go over this first movement very carefully, try to play up the tempo, and suddenly that slow speech was gone. It was a learning experience. He was very kind man, and this lesson for us was really something. That was at his apartment. I don't remember which floor, third or fourth floor, and I was with him for a lesson on a particular day. Let's see, must have been what, 60, well, I was in Europe, 60, 61. Anyhow, our president, US president, came to Paris that particular day, John F. Kennedy. And while at the lesson in his apartment, we heard these sirens, and we looked out the window on the street below. Kennedy's motorcade was passing. What a time. And I happened to have this on and recorded. I was recording my lesson. That's quite a memory.
And when you were in Paris, where did you have the opportunity to practice saxophone?
Oh, that's a good question. Most neighbors, we lived in, we were fortunate through a friend to have us, we had a tiny apartment, but we didn't have an apartment. And I checked with neighbors in the building. And what they said to me, mais c'est votre métier, il faut travailler ici, c'est pas un problème. In other words, this is your major, you should practice, don't worry about disturbing us. They were very kind. However, I was playing a LeBlanc saxophone at the time, and I became quite acquainted with Léon Leblanc, the LeBlanc factory. There was a small factory not far, was walking distance from our apartment, and I did most of my practicing there in the factory. It's also in that factory where I met Charles Houfnagel. That name will not be familiar to most of us, but Houfnagel was a master acoustician. His main area of work and study was musical acoustics as it related to musical instruments. He's the one who, are we okay, Carl? Can you see me?
Yep, we're good.
Oh, I lost you for just a moment. I think we're okay now. Anyhow, just to give you a little background, Charles Houfnagel was the person, he was the major acoustician in the design of the buffet, the famous buffet clarinet. So I was lucky to meet him, and in effect, I had many lessons from him, a couple of times a month. Just loved to talk. He was a little lonely, and he loved to talk. And he would ask me a question, something to do with acoustics or overblowing or harmonics. And whatever the question was, I didn't know the answer. And so my response was, je ne sais pas, I do not know. And he would say, and this was all in French, he would say, of course you don't know. Sit down and I will explain this to you. He was a very kind gentleman, and from him, some very, I thought, interesting and important things, the construction of our instrument. And that later really came into play when I was invited to join the Yamaha people. And I became the chief advisor to them in the construction of the Yamaha YAS 62.
Many years later.
That was a 5 or 6 year project, but it was highly interesting. So that's a long way around, but you asked me where I practiced, the LeBlanc factory.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship with Yamaha and the research that you put into the saxophone and the current saxophones that most of us are playing on now, compared to the one that you were playing on while you were in Paris.
Yes. Well, they're quite different. Most saxophonists today have no experience with a LeBlanc saxophone, or if they do, it's very minimal. But my main connection with Yamaha was that the people at the Yamaha company made some inquiries about me from various people, and when they learned that I had been studying in France and that I knew Charles Houfnagel,
Is he frozen for anybody else?
Yes, he's frozen.
Okay. Stand by. Well, until we get Dr. Rousseau back, I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. Maybe he's having connectivity issues.
So, Dr. Johnson, what are you working on?
A lot of scales these days, and then I've been kind of going back and forth between a lot of sight reading practice, and then pieces that I never got to as a student. So I just ordered the Schmidt Legend. I don't know if you know that piece. Been working on that. Working on extended techniques, that kind of thing. It's been kind of a challenge just to get creative and looking to fill gaps in things maybe I haven't worked on in a while. So, and you said you're playing Bozza Aria, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Did anybody do anything interesting over break?
Got a PS5.
Well, that's pretty neat.
Ooh.
Aren't those like really hard to come by right now?
They're extremely.
Hi, everyone. Okay, Dr. Rousseau is having some connectivity issues, so if you can hear him, we're going to try to do it this way. Can you say a few words, Dr. Rousseau, and let's see if we can all hear you.
Yes, well, sorry about that connection problem, but I'm here and I know you're there, and I hope we can communicate this way.
Sounds good.
Sound okay?
Can you all hear? Okay, everybody's shaking their heads, so I think we're good.
Okay, so just an overview, just to back up a little, just to review quickly. So I couldn't start, really, I didn't major on saxophone. I couldn't do that in the beginning, and I couldn't do that toward the end of my studies either. But I was certainly able to learn a lot about music, which helped me in my career because I studied the other woodwind instruments. And I got acquainted with, for example, the Brahms Sonata, the music for clarinet by Brahms. Fantastic. And I had an idea that someday I might be able to play this music on saxophone, which I did. It's marvelous repertory. So I think what I'm trying to tell you is there are many possibilities. We have many possibilities for learning. We never stop learning. And if a certain avenue doesn't seem to be open for you, try another one. Try a different approach.
Well, Dr. Rousseau, I have many, many questions. I could talk to you all day, but maybe some of the students would have a question for you. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Dr. Rousseau?
I'll go. One of my questions was like, I looked at your website and it said that you worked on the committee, or was the co-founder of the World Saxophone Congress. So I was wondering if you could like talk about that and like how that went, the process for that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I was contacted in 1968. I had only been at Indiana University for 4 or 5 years. And I was contacted by a Canadian saxophonist, Paul Brody. Some of you may know that name. Paul Brody was a very enthusiastic saxophonist, and he presented to me his idea of having a World Saxophone Congress. So we discussed it, and we decided to do it. And we were able to get a day in conjunction with the Midwest National Band Clinic. One of those days, we were able to meet for the first time with those who are interested in the World Saxophone Congress. Well, Paul Brody and I had no idea what would happen on that first meeting. Would we have 50 people in attendance? What would happen? Well, as it turned out, there were approximately 500 people who came to this meeting, the first meeting. And that's how the World Saxophone Congress got started. And Brody and I felt very strongly that we should have Sigurd Rascher and Marcel Mule in attendance. How to do this? So I called Mr. Rasher, explained what we were doing, and I said, and Marcel Mule will join us. Well, he said, if Mr. Mule is coming, I'll come also. So then I called Mr. Mule and told him Mr. Rasher was coming. Well, he said, if Mr. Rasher is coming, I will come also. So this is basically how we got started. We had a tremendous success the first day. It was a one-day event, one session event. And then we decided to meet again the following year. And then it was, just to make a long story short, there wasn't enough time in between sessions. So we thought, well, we should have a two every 2 years. So we tried that. And then the Congress was in Toronto. And then it was in Bordeaux. And it went in various places throughout the world. That's how the World Saxophone Congress got started.
Any other questions for Dr. Rousseau?
I have a question. So regarding your work with Yamaha, was that like in your opportunity to sort of innovate the saxophone, like Dr. Hodgins told me about, like some stuff with like the high F sharp key and things in that sort of vein? Was that more out of necessity, or is that more about of just having the opportunity?
You mean for the design and construction?
Yeah.
Well, Yamaha really wanted to produce a great saxophone. That was their objective. And so we started what I would call at the beginning. And not to get technical, but I presented three general guidelines that we needed to follow. One was to have an instrument that was mechanically solid, that is, all the moving parts worked efficiently and worked well. Second was acoustically, that it was a good instrument. Now by that, we're talking about the size and placement of the tone holes. We're talking about the rate of taper. That is, as you all know, the saxophone is a conical instrument. But what is the rate of this conical shape? Could it be altered? Well, it certainly could, either for the whole section or parts of sections. So there was that aspect. And then the third item, also very important, is the artistic feeling. That is to say, supposing we came up with a saxophone that mechanically was fantastic, the acoustics we thought were great. Now we hand this over to players, and they say, I don't like this, I don't like that. That's the artistic consideration, and that always enters in. So those are the three basic guidelines. And as I may have mentioned, we worked, I think it was 5 years. We worked 5 years, and in 5 years, I went to Japan every 6 months. So if I was going there every 6 months, that meant we had about, 10 prototypes? So I would get some modifications on a basic instrument, would come back to Indiana, make notations, send them off to the crew in Japan, and then I would go back to Japan and we would work on the next phase and so on. That's how it got started.
Any other questions?
Gee, you should have told me that the guys you worked with became like family.
How often did you go to Japan, Dr. Rousseau?
I went roughly every 6 months.
For how long?
Usually 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, I would be there. I calculated one time that I've spent about 2 years of my life in Japan, 2 weeks at a time.
I have a quick question. So, Dr. Rousseau, obviously you came up in a time when, saxophone as a focus, as a primary instrument, especially in college study, wasn't as common and wasn't even possible when you first started. When you decided to make the turn to really focus, did you feel like you were taking a big risk at the time? Was it kind of scary?
No, I didn't really. I didn't feel that way. I've always, as I may have mentioned, I've always loved the saxophone, and I think partly in answer to your question, why I didn't feel risk was I also had other options, as I mentioned, to study the other woodwind instruments. So I never felt like I was completely alone.
You got it.
Very good.
And Dr. Rousseau, you were also a very capable conductor as well.
I really enjoyed conducting, and in fact, this is a story that most people don't know, and I don't advertise. I don't talk about it. But when I first came to Indiana, I was here. I think I was here 2 years, maybe 3 years. When the dean called me in one day and said that he asked me what is the personnel? What is the total number of people involved in a wind ensemble? And I said, well, it varies, but maybe 48 or 50, something around that number. And he looked at a program he had from Indiana University. It said wind ensemble, and there were 90 players listed. So he said, we're going to have 2 wind ensembles, and I'd like you to conduct one. Now, I think he brought that up because as a part of my background, when I was in the military, I was assistant band leader of the 25th Infantry Division. And that helped me a lot in conducting and learning repertory and so forth. So that's how that got started. And I think it was near the end of that first season when the dean asked me if I would like to be director of bands. Now this is a big position. This is why I mentioned earlier that I don't talk about this, but I was offered to be director of bands at Indiana University. And that is a point where and this partly answers the previous question, where in talking about risk, I had the opportunity to be a director of bands at a major university. And I decided not to do that because I was starting to feel pretty good about the classical saxophone. So I decided to stay there, stay with that.
Could you talk very briefly, Dr. Rousseau, about maybe your practice? Like, what would you work on, and what would you suggest that we work on if we have an hour practice? Like, what can we work on for towards the end of the semester?
Excellent idea. Number one, tone quality. Now, a basic test is to play octaves. And it was very common for me with my students. I would ask them to play, let's say we're on the staff now. We're looking at saxophone music on the 5 lines, 4 spaces, in that range. And I might say play B, A, G, A, B, just those 3 notes. Just go back and forth slowly. And then as you're doing it, as they're doing it, I would sometimes press the octave key. Octave slurs. You should be able to play an octave slur. That is, if you're playing B natural, and no octave key, and I lift the octave key up, it should go an octave higher. And when I close the octave key, it should go back. That balance, I hope I'm making myself clear. That's one of the greatest tests to see if your embouchure and air are working well, is to be able to play octave slurs. That as I said at the beginning, practice tone quality. So that will address that. Now, as far as technique, I've learned a phrase. I don't know when. I don't know. I was probably in high school when I heard somebody give the definition of a short note. A short note is a long note played short, and that stuck with me. And that's so true. So true. So you want this good tone quality, but you want it to follow through on every note of every piece that you play. Which leads me to the next point, and that is, and I remember a session with Rousseau, where he told me he wanted me to play. I came in one day, I don't remember the piece or the etude, and he said, and I'd like you to play the tempo 132. And I looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, Maestro. I've practiced this, but I cannot play this at 132. He said, yes, you can, and I'll show you how. This was a great learning moment for me, because what he did was have me play the first measure or two measures, and that was it. The metronome was going, and I just played it. If I couldn't get the two measures, he would cut it back to one measure. Just that small segment. So by practicing segments up to tempo, I was eventually able to put segments together and get larger pieces of the piece or etude. So I think those are three of the most important items I could tell you.
That's really great. I still work on those things
Oh,
every day. Does anybody else have a question for Dr. Rousseau?
I have one more question. I was wondering if you could talk about the origins and kind of the reasoning behind making the high tones book.
I'm sorry, could you rephrase it? The reason for
the high tones book, your high tones book.
Well, I was interested. I mean, why did I produce that?
Yeah.
Well, as I was working with students, I realized that there wasn't any approach to some of these altissimo notes. So I thought I would write about it. And that's how it got started. I don't remember when the first edition came out. I don't honestly remember the year, but that was the reason behind it. And as I kept working with this in the second edition or current edition, if some of you have this book, you'll notice I talk about the different modes of overtone, how they're related. For example, just going above high F, let's say F sharp D, G sharp A, in that range, there are different fingerings that work. How are they related? And so I wanted to bring that up. So I felt there was a need for the book, and that's how it got started.
You've had many firsts in your career writing these books where there was a need for. There wasn't, any pedagogy published like that before. You recorded the first album, classical saxophone album, the concertos with the orchestra on Deutsche Grammophon. You also played a lot of the first saxophone recitals in Paris, Oslo, Helsinki, London. Is there anything that stands out to you in your memory as being really prescient or memorable, or is a good memory for you from all of that?
Yes. I think one of the experiences that really stands out for me is I became acquainted. I had an invitation to play in a recital in Vienna, and it was from somebody I knew. In fact, the person I knew was Rudolf Yedel, who was a solo clarinetist in the Vienna Philharmonic, who loved the saxophone, by the way. And so he said it would be a shared program. The pianist would play his solos, and then this pianist would accompany me on my solos. It turned out this pianist was Heinz Moritz, who was the pianist in the Haydn Trio of Vienna. We became good colleagues and wonderful friends. And so I think one of the most memorable experiences as a performer was when the Haydn Trio of Vienna invited me to join them in a celebration concert. It was their 25th anniversary as a trio. And they had this concert in the Concerthaus in Vienna. And when we were preparing that night of the concert, the manager of the hall came up to us and said, "Gentlemen, we've sold every ticket. We'd like to set up some chairs on the stage with your permission." So here I was playing in Vienna in the Concerthaus with the Haydn Trio. It wasn't only a full house, it was an overflow house. And people were all around us watching our music, watching my hand position fingers. It was really an unusual, memorable experience.
Sounds like a wonderful memory.
It sure is.
We're just about at time here. Do you have any final advice for us?
Well, I've tried to help students in as many different ways as I can. And one of the points that I think has helped is to remind my students, and you might remind yourself, when you practice, to try to achieve something in your, maybe it's a very small point, but think positive. Try to accomplish something, and don't become frustrated if things don't go the way you want. Sometimes what happens and what creates little mental blocks is that we're trying to do too much in too short a time period. Time is important. It takes time. We can have speed without learning, but we really can't have much learning without beginning slowly. And so try to accomplish something. Try to think positive. What is it you're learning? Maybe it's just one new fingering, or maybe it's a certain section of a piece you're playing. Work on it. Try to come out of that session feeling that you've made some progress. We build success on success. We build. This is how we go forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rousseau. I very much appreciate your time today. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with all of us.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to have met you, all of you, and I wish all of you well. Dr. Hutchins, I wish you continued success. You're doing so many things. Keep those things going. Keep those things going. Vive le saxophone.
On n'arrive jamais.
C'est vrai. C'est vrai. On n'arrive jamais. I think your students know what that means.
I think they do too.
All the best, everybody. All the best.
All right. Thank you all.
Hey, Dr. Jacobson, I just wanted to say hello.
Hi. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, it took me a while to get organized here, so I don't use Zoom very often. I couldn't even find the mute button. So, but we're set now. Figured it out.
You're in good company.
Yeah. Technology challenged. Okay, yeah. But it's good to see you. Good to see you.
Likewise. Be well.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Kyle.